Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Nesta and Centre for Net Zero event on HeatFlex, the untapped potential of automated heat pump flexibility. I'm Andy Regan from Nesta. I'm a senior mission manager in the Sustainable Future mission team, where, amongst other things, I look after all our work on energy demand flexibility. For those of you who don't know us, Nesta is the UK's innovation agency for social good. We combine multidisciplinary approaches spanning design, data science, behavioural insights, and rigorous research to drive impact across our three missions. In a fairer start, we're looking at how to narrow the outcome gap between the most and least advantaged children in the early years. In a healthy life, we want to improve healthy life expectancy through tackling obesity. And in our Sustainable Future mission, which we're focusing on today, we're trying to speed up the decarbonisation of the UK's homes. Decarbonising homes means rapidly scaling up the rollout of heat pumps as the best available technology to replace fossil fuel heating systems. This scale up is going to mean challenges for the wider energy system through a major increase in energy demand, but it's also widely been assumed that heat pumps can also play a role in managing the system and smoothing peaks if they can be used flexibly, and that is if we can shift their demand for electricity away from peak times. So we've been testing how well this can work in real life over the past 2 winters through our HeatFlex project, which has been delivered in partnership with our good friends at Centre for Net Zero. Centre for Net Zero is a non-profit, impact-driven energy research institute founded by renewable energy group Octopus Energy. CNZ operates autonomously, combining the roles of industry researcher, advanced modelling innovation startup, and research to policy conduit. They provide policymakers with innovative data analysis and research to propel the energy transition into reality. So today's session is going to be in 2 parts. In the first, we're going to hear from my colleagues Ollie Berry from Nesta and Daniel Lopez Garcia from CNZ. They're going to present on the HeatFlex project in a moment, covering the methods and the findings. We'll take then a short round of questions from you on the project itself, any clarification questions or methodology questions. So please do start submitting those throughout the presentation, and we will select some at the end to discuss with Danny and Ollie. We're then going to move on to a panel discussion where we'll be joined by some speakers from Ofgem, Smart Energy GB, and Centre for Net Zero, and I'll introduce them properly later. And you'll then again be able to put your questions to the panel about the wider issues raised by our trial. To ask your questions, please post these in the YouTube or LinkedIn chat, and they'll be picked up during the Q&A. So that's it for the kind of housekeeping up front. So without any further preamble, let me introduce my HeatFlex team colleagues who are going to talk you through the project. I'm going to be joined by Ollie Berry, who is a senior researcher at Nesta in the Sustainable Future mission team. He specialises in quantitative research, including impact evaluation, design, and quasi-experimental methods. Hi, Ollie. And we're also joined by Daniel Lopez Garcia, is a research manager at Centre for Net Zero. He's responsible for supporting several research areas spanning flexibility, energy markets, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and solar generation. And Daniel's previously worked at Aurora Energy Research in the UK and Accenture in Spain. Hi, Danny. Welcome both. So yeah, no more from me. I'm just going to hand over to you, Danny, to start telling us all about the HeatFlex project.
Thank you very much, Andy, and welcome everybody. We're very excited to share the findings of these 2 winters, and yeah, let's give me 1 second until we can have the slides on the screen. So I'll introduce basically what we did in the research, how we do it, and then I'll also explain a little bit about the first research area that we cover. Then I'll pass on to Ollie to further explain a little bit more about all the interesting findings that we could gather during these 2 years. So if we move on to the next slide, everything starts from a very simple question, but I think, in my opinion, a very important one, and is, can we actually provide any flexibility by using heat pumps in a way in which we actually don't disturb customers that much? We know that this is going to be important as the heat pump market grows. So basically, this all started HeatFlex, this partnership that we're doing with Nesta, and we have actually developed an intervention in which we check if something that is very automatic, that doesn't involve customers directly that much, while trying to maintain thermal comfort, can actually provide some flexibility. So if we move on to the next slide, we actually give a little bit more reason as to why this is important. Why do we actually want to reduce peak demand? Most of you will know, but basically just to summarize in two very simple points as well. Peak demand usually means that we're using a lot of gas and a lot of coal, so that renders a lot of pollution to the atmosphere. As we tackle climate change, this is going to be important to move that demand to other periods in which generation can be cleaner and we can utilize more renewable energy sources. And more importantly, this is the second point, as we actually electrify other sectors of the economy, such as transport and also heat itself, we're going to have increasing levels of demand. So if we actually see these low carbon technologies such as heat pumps, batteries, electric vehicles, etc., if we see them as a solution to this problem, we can actually use them flexibly, smartly, intelligently to then provide a solution to that. This will actually give a lot of benefits to customers just because we're usually moving that electricity from periods in which electricity is very expensive. So this is a benefit not only for the system, but also for the final consumers, which is very important to us. So moving on to the next slide, we came up with a very simple intervention. We wanted to test something that is actually very simple to understand, but just to see what is the basically lower bound of flexibility while maintaining thermal comfort. So we install smart thermostats in people's houses and also heat pump monitoring devices. We also give them some surveys to then test what is the actual thermal envelope of our customers. We want to know what are the temperatures that they elicit to be the maximum and minimal acceptable temperatures. With that, we build something such as we have on the screen right now. We know that people are going to operate differently and all of our customers are going to have different thermal envelopes, but the research itself is very general to everybody. We're going to increase the temperature to that maximum elicited temperature that I mentioned a moment ago. And we do this automatically through an API that Octopus Energy developed to control this smart thermostat during 2 hours. We call this the preheating period. Here we're effectively heating up the house. Then when electricity prices are very expensive, or when pollution, like the levels of pollution are quite intensive as well, we lower that temperature to the minimum elicited temperature. We call this a flexibility window that usually spans over 2 hours as well. And then after that, we go back to normal levels when that peak demand period has finished. And then we check through all the information that we get from the smart thermostat, smart meters in houses, and the heat pump monitor, we check what is the actual impact of this intervention. All of this done automatically. If we move on to the next slide, we actually want to emphasize this. One of the main, two of the main, points that we have to highlight here is that we have a fully automated intervention. Customers don't have to turn on or off the heat pump that much. Everything happens through an API, and this is something that we are testing as well. And we are trying to maintain those comfort levels. We are effectively trying to see whether participants actually notice anything by doing this intervention. And this is something, these two features are very novel, and this is something that we wanted to test in our intervention. So basically, this translates into 3 different research areas that we can see on the next slide. And this can be summarized on these very basic points. First, we want to check whether comfort is maintained. We're asking our participants if they actually felt any discomfort while experiencing the events. Second, we want to check whether this automation is acceptable, because we know that heating is something very sensitive. We know that we need to check whether this brings any discomfort to our participants, and especially when we are controlling, like a third party, such as ourselves, is controlling the heating for them during 4 hours during the day. And lastly, but more importantly, we're actually checking whether this intervention actually provides any flexibility to the grid. We're checking if we can actually shift that consumption during peak times to other times during the day. And these are the 3 main points that we're going to try and explain and tackle during this presentation. We did this through a randomized control trial setting. On the next slide, we have more information about this. We did this for 43 participants from Octopus Energy participants who already had a heat pump. And we can see here a little bit of the composition of our cohort. We can see that predominantly we have overrepresentation of male main participants, 75% of these. We can also see that more than 60% of our participants are in the age bracket between 55 and 84 years old. That also gives an indication of the results that we are getting through through our trial, and we can see that 50%, roughly 50% of the households that we are studying here today are on EPCC. So we don't have an overrepresentation of very insulated houses, but we can see that, you know, our cohort has very specific characteristics. As I said, we did this through a randomized control trial. In the next slide, we explain this a little bit more. So we actually allocated these 43 participants into two different groups. One of them is the control group, and basically these participants don't go through events whatsoever. They are just operating normally. We don't touch their heat pump. We can see what is happening at the household level, at the heat pump level, and through the smart thermostat, but they don't suffer the events, quote unquote. Whereas the treatment group, randomly allocated as well, is the group of participants that actually experience the events. We send them surveys, we learn through their experience, and then by comparing these two groups, we can see in the control group what would have happened if HeatFlex wasn't a thing, if events never happened, and compare them to the treatment group. By doing so, we can actually get very strong evidence to then answer all the research areas that we explained a moment ago. We did this in 27 different events from February 2024 to April 2024, and the readings that we got were a smart meter consumption, smart thermostat for the temperatures, and the consumption of the heat pump directly. We have here a representation of when the events happen. We also have some variability. Some of the events have longer flexibility windows. We also tested some morning events, and we can see that the last three events, these weren't considered in the analysis of the trial because we actually use all the participants in our sample, so they also experience HeatFlex events, and we could have some of the, basically all of the experiences that participants in the control group will have given us if they were actively participating in all the events as well. But again, these weren't considered in the final research, just because it's not within the randomized control trial setting. I'm going to explain a little bit the answers of the first research area. In the next slide, we are basically seeing what happened with the comfort. Did participants actually notice anything during the HeatFlex events? Was the comfort acceptable for them? As I said, we sent them surveys to basically check what were the minimum and maximum elicited temperatures, and these varied a lot from different participants in the control group and the treatment group. Some people like to be warmer, some people like to be at slightly colder temperatures in their house. And in the next slide, we actually have a representation of this. We can see lighter curves. This is all the events for all the participants in the control and the treatment, but let's focus on the actual average temperature. We can see that before and after the event, average temperatures were actually very similar between control and treatment, but we do see an effective increase in temperature of 0.85 degrees Celsius during the preheating period. So we are actually increasing the temperature, but roughly not even one degree Celsius. And then during the flexibility window, that temperature decreases, but to a lower degree, only 0.69 degrees Celsius. So basically, the intervention that we're using doesn't actually change temperatures that much during the whole event. And actually, at the end of it, maybe because of the thermal mass of the houses retains some of that heat, temperature doesn't actually go down to the same level that we had before, giving an indication that the flexibility window could even be elongated a little bit more, and participants won't even notice because the temperature was mostly maintained. To answer the question that we were asking ourselves, is this intervention comfortable? Is acceptable to customers from a comfort point of view? In the next slide, we actually see that more than 90% of our participants, after every single event, when we asked them through surveys, reported that they were satisfied with the events. So the answer is mostly yes, broadly yes. We did see very high levels of comfort. Participants didn't actually suffer that much from this intervention because temperatures didn't effectively change a lot. Now I'm going to pass it over to Oli. He will explain about the other two research areas. And as Andy said, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat.
Great, thanks very much, Danny. And yeah, very excited to be here sharing these results with you today. So I'm going to cover off the second research area, which is about the acceptability of our intervention. So what did participants feel about the fact that we were remotely controlling their heating systems. So the way we set about answering this was using interviews. And we used what we call the floor plan exercise interviews to help us understand kind of what people felt about the intervention, how people behaved during events. This is a really, really important part of the research. So doing this exercise was very, very helpful. And what it basically consisted of was us asking participants to send us floor plans of their homes. And then during the interviews, we'd talk through kind of where their radiators were placed, the smart thermostats were, and what the kind of experience of the events was using this floor plan as a kind of keystone to the interviews. And as you can see from this slide, this helped us to really understand how different participants had different experiences. So this is just an example, but you know, people had warm spots and cold spots, and this changed the experience of their events. So this was a very, very helpful way of guiding the interviews and helping people really recall what happened during the events themselves. So what does this mean in terms of how people found the events and found the automation of their heating? So the main finding we had across all participants was that they were very comfortable with us remotely controlling their heating. So people trusted us as researchers, trusted Octopus, and we didn't find any complaints in terms of people being uncomfortable with the idea of automating their heat pumps. One of the other interesting aspects that came out in interviews as well was that people sometimes didn't notice the events were happening whatsoever. So this was particularly the case for householders who weren't the main point of contact, because we were sending emails to the main kind of householder to let them know when events were so they could opt out. But in some cases, they didn't always tell other people at home whether events were happening or not. And in those instances, we found that people didn't necessarily notice. So here are some quotes on the screen that reflect that finding. But really, I think it supports this idea that people were happy with automation, that they didn't have problems with it. Moreover, just the experience was broadly very acceptable to participants, which is a great finding and definitely gives us support for this kind of automation being something that could be used in the future. So that's the second research area. Let's talk about the final research area now, which is about whether we can shift demand. So were we able to change household consumption through the remote operation of the heat pumps? So when it came to consumption, we actually measured it at two different levels. So we measured it firstly at a household level. So we had access to smart meter data. So we were able to see what household consumption was like during events. Of course, this captures not only the heat pump consumption, but other devices at home that might be using up electricity, like microwaves or EVs. So it kind of captures the whole house, and that's what the electricity grid sees. We also measured consumption of the heat pump directly with heat pump monitors. So we installed these devices into people's homes, and this allowed us to see directly what was happening with heat pump consumption. And this ended up being very, very valuable for reasons I'll get onto in a second. So let's talk about the results. So the main result is that we saw a 32% reduction in households that took part in events compared to those that didn't. So this was statistically significant, and we think is a really meaningful reduction in terms of household consumption for this kind of automated heat flexibility. This is particularly given that we were able to maintain temperatures and that people didn't notice the events as well. So to have this kind of reduction without people getting too cold or being unhappy, I think is really, really key. The second result is looking at heat pump consumption. So we actually saw a much bigger decrease in heat pump consumption when we looked at homes that took part in events compared to those that didn't. So we saw a 74% reduction. This is quite a lot larger than the 32% household reduction we found. And one of the reasons for this might be the fact that at a household level, other things are contributing to electricity consumption, but actually we wouldn't expect there to be such a big decrease. And this is really where having both household consumption and heat pump consumption data was helpful, because we think that the reason why we saw this big difference between the two was actually due to the presence of solar panels and batteries. So in half the homes in our sample, they had a battery. In 3/4, they had solar panels. And we were able to look at consumption for these households, both at the household level and heat pump level, to see what was happening during events. So for homes that didn't have batteries and solar panels, we saw that household consumption was typically a bit higher than heat pump consumption, as you might expect. However, for homes that had batteries and solar panels, household consumption could be much less than heat pump consumption, because homes were because they were powering their homes using batteries. In some cases, we heard from interviews that homes were using no electricity from the grid during events, so their household consumption was zero. And even if we made a big change in heat pump consumption from remotely controlling it, we actually wouldn't see any decrease in household consumption, which is why when you look at the average on household consumption, is actually much smaller, because it's kind of a midpoint between potentially close to 0 and 74. For homes that don't have these technologies, we think the actual household reduction could be closer to 74%, because they aren't powering their homes using these devices. So that's kind of a snapshot from the results from the trial. Just to kind of summarize, we think our trial demonstrated the fact that heat pump consumption can be controlled using this kind of intervention, and that automated heat pump flexibility can work. More importantly, we showed that preheating seems to be effective at maintaining internal temperatures, and that participants were broadly happy. So we think this is really promising results for the use of automated heat pump flexibility in terms of controlling peak demand. So the final slide is, what does this mean for policy? The first thing is that kind of key point. We think automated heat pump flexibility could be used at scale and could provide a meaningful amount of demand shifting at scale. The second kind of two implications are about moderators. So what might affect the extent to which we can use heat pump flexibility at scale? The first is around interoperability. So the key point here is that for people who took part in our trial, we had to install a smart thermostat to enable us to control their heat pumps remotely. And the extent to which we can do that in the future depends on what happens in terms of heat pump adoption. And the key kind of thing here is, if we are to scale this up, we do need some kind of consistent way that works for multiple homes if we are going to be able to remotely control their heat pump. The second implication and kind of effect on the extent to which this can be used at scale is the prevalence of batteries and solar panels and other low carbon technologies. For homes that are already using these technologies, we saw from our trial that the amount of demand shifting is lower, whereas for homes that didn't have them, the amount of demand shifting is greater. So depending on how prevalent these technologies are in the future, we might see differing levels of demand shifted in aggregation. And this is one of the key things that could affect that. So that's the end of the presentation. Thanks very much for listening. I think we'll move into the next section, which is about questions.
Thanks, Ollie, and thanks, Danny, and thanks to everybody who's been posting questions in the chat. I'm going to start by answering the one from Louise Sunderland, who's asking about preheating, and then I'll probably move on to the ones that are about essentially the variations we brought in the trial. So Louise is asking, preheating, warming up people to cool them down might be more disruptive to comfort than just turning down heat from the regular temperature. I think absolutely right, Louise, that may well be some people's experiences of how that feels in their home. They might not like it, they might find it annoying. The reason that we particularly focused on preheating within the intervention is one of the reasons for doing this work is not just to sort of test flexibility from heat pumps themselves, but to sort of validate or disprove some of the really big assumptions that have been made about flexibility and things like the sixth carbon budget pathway, where a lot of the assumption is that flexibility will be delivered by doing preheating in order to sort of maintain comfort during that period. So that's the reason we were particularly interested. But absolutely, some people might prefer just to turn it down and not to do that. And then similar to Jonathan Waxman's made a similar question that another method might be preferable. So that's why we focused in on that. But you're absolutely right to flag that might not be the best way of doing it for everybody. We then have a couple of questions that I think perhaps I'll put to Danny. So Liz Barker has asked what was the main peak demand period we were trying to avoid in the trial. Was it 5 to 7 p.m? And then Oliver Sutton has asked what were the DSR lengths, essentially what was the length of the period of time that we were testing, and how did the results differ with those lengths? So perhaps you could, Danny, talk about some of the variations we did within the trial.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, we had to actually breeze through this. We could have gone and explained this into more detail, but we wanted to have some more time for the question. So basically, the periods that we tested, usually the preheating window will go from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. And then the flexibility window will go from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., trying to avoid peak times at around 7 p.m., like you mentioned this. We did test some variations. We actually had longer flexibility events with like a 3-hour window and a 4-hour window. So basically from 6 to 9 and from 6 to 10 as well, just to test how long or how far we could actually go with our customers not feeling a lot of discomfort. It is true that we tested some preheating during the first trial that we did last winter, but we didn't test that much this year with no preheating. Only one event had no preheating phases. We actually wanted to have like a very stable intervention to not vary and not kind of like mimic wholesale prices, if that makes sense, to basically give something consistent to our customers. But the DSR lens that we were trying to test from the start were 2 hours. So basically 4 settlement periods. We did have like some longer events, but mainly all of the events or the majority of the events were 2 hours DSR.
Thanks, Danny. Ollie, I'll come to you with another question. I'm trying to whiz through as many as we can. Ashley Molster has asked, probably the biggest question we would have expected people to ask, saying we've had an impressively small change in temperature. Did we compare the temperature change over the period with the different EPC levels? So we have touched on this up front, but that's the key question really. Can you talk about the kind of analysis we did based on correlation with EPC ratings? EPC, for anyone who's perhaps not sure, is a measure of how much energy a home uses.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So unfortunately, we weren't able to make any robust comparisons between different EPCs because of the fact that our sample was small. You can see differences between homes, but what's difficult to establish with a small number of homes is whether that's because of EPC versus some other factor that we haven't captured. So we haven't kind of presented results on that because we kind of don't have enough confidence in the robustness of them. It's fair to say that EPC, you would imagine, would change how much a temperature can heat up and decrease because of different thermal properties. But we didn't want to overclaim in our analysis by kind of making conclusions or inferences based on a very, very small number of households.
Thanks, Ollie. And then another one that I think perhaps will go to you, because I know we've thought about this. Mark Tyler has asked, have you considered that females feel the effects of colder temperatures more than males, and that the majority of your participants are males? So just to back up Mark's point, there's certainly some kind of previous research that we reviewed early in the project that suggests that point is broadly fair, that there are differences that kind of correlate with gender and sex differences. So Ollie, perhaps you could just talk about how we kind of address that within the trial.
Yeah, so Mark, I think that's a really, really important question, and very much are aware of the differences between people essentially in terms of the temperature they feel. So the way we set about addressing this was to kind of provide different household members to complete our surveys, and we also interview different household members as well. And so we did find differences between different household members. But once again, what I would say is we didn't have enough people to be able to draw meaningful conclusions. So we once again didn't kind of try to overclaim based on our sample, but we certainly do recognize the fact that different people in homes can essentially experience temperature changes differently. And we think it is an important part of thermal comfort that should be addressed with future research.
Thanks, both of you, and thanks to everybody for the questions. We sort of have run out of time, and we've got quite a few coming through. So perhaps what we could do is when we follow up with you afterwards and share the slides from the event, we can perhaps try and answer some of the questions that we haven't got to in writing. Some of them are covered in the report, so please do go to either the Nesta or CNZ websites to download it. But thanks, Ollie. Thanks, Danny, for the presentations and for answering those questions. So now we are going to move into the panel discussion section, just to share some reflections on the work and what it means more generally for the future of energy flexibility. So we're going to be joined now by Andrew Shine, who is Director of Trials and Analysis at Centre for Net Zero. His team undertakes field trials and quasi-experimental analyses in collaboration with teams within the Octopus Energy Group and external partners. Prior to this, Andrew worked at the Behavioural Insights team and at Nesta, where he was a senior advisor in their energy and sustainability team. Before going to BIT, Andrew was one of the first 20 employees at Bulb, who at the time were a fast-growing energy supplier startup. Also joined by Sarah Hyam, who is Director at Corporate Affairs at Smart Energy GB, and the body that engages consumers in the smart meter rollout. She has worked in policy, public affairs and corporate affairs in several sectors and organisation types, including Parliament, trade and membership associations, and a FTSE 250 company. She's worked in energy since 2017 across a range of energy issues, including energy efficiency and building retrofit, price regulation, vulnerable customer support, decarbonisation strategy, and smart meters. So great to have you with us, Sarah. Hi. And finally, we're joined by Marzia Zafar, who is a global leader in energy transition and disruptive technologies, with more than 25 years in the electric and natural gas industry. Marzia is currently Ofgem's Deputy Director with responsibility to encourage deployment of innovations to speed up the pace of digitalisation and decentralisation in the energy system, which sounds difficult, as we have learned. So hi, Marzia. So a reminder to submit your own questions for the panel throughout the discussion, and we'll ask as many as we can at the end. Let me know if you want to direct your question to a particular panel member. But I'm going to start by coming to Andrew. So you and I, we've been working on this trial together across the two teams for 2 years now. It's been fun and challenging. I just wanted to start by asking you, now that we've completed it, are you more or less optimistic than you were before about the potential of heat pump flexibility?
Yeah, I think I'm feeling very bullish on heat pump flexibility based on what we found in this project. Centre for Net Zero recently did an analysis of customers on COSY, which is an Octopus energy tariff that incentivizes heat pump owners to turn up in off-peak periods and turn down in peak periods. And we found really large impacts, doubling of consumption in the off-peak and halving consumption in the peak. And there's different sources of suggestive evidence that that's from customers setting smart thermostats and similar, even sort of very similar to what we did as a third party in this trial. But it was really nice to then have this companion piece of work where we got to do it ourselves and get under the hood and see if it works to do something as simple and soft as turning the set points up a little bit beforehand and turning the set points down during the flex window. And, before we did this research, you might have worried that a heat pump is too complex for such a soft intervention. Maybe the heat pump will rebel in some unexpected way. Maybe the heat pump will try to outthink your simple DSR method. Maybe the thermal inertia will make the effects kind of slow and noisy. Maybe customers won't like it and we'll just change the set points back. So in my opinion, there was a lot of uncertainty on whether such a soft intervention would have impacts. And we see, as Ollie and Danny showed, really large impacts in our sample. So I think these two pieces of work now combine. The piece of work on COSY shows that customers are delivering this flex at scale in the real world. And then this piece of work, HeatFlex, gives us a good idea of how it's happening, where the set point control is sufficient, despite being really quite simple and soft, as I say. So just to answer your question directly, I do think that has implications for what we can expect in the future when heat pumps are more widespread. You might worry that heat pump flexibility is quite difficult. So while it's possible to deliver large impacts, we only expect that from certain types of customers. But seeing that we can do it with just set point control makes me quite bullish that it could be quite widespread.
Yeah, I think I would say the same in terms of the simplicity of the intervention. Like it's very easy, as we've touched on earlier, with the questions about preheating, for example, to imagine much more sophisticated and granular controls, different ways of controlling the heat pump that would probably deliver more flexibility. But as a sort of basic intervention, perhaps for households who only have a heat pump in the future and don't have much more kind of smart tech in their home than that, it's a pretty good baseline to sort of calibrate up from. I guess it just to sort of acknowledge a point that's sometimes been made in talking about the trial, and you've mentioned that the different types of consumers. We would tend to kind of put the caveat that the participants in the HeatFlex trial often tended to be like fairly engaged themselves. A lot of them had actually much more sophisticated systems than the one we were putting in place, and we really benefited from that from a lot of them. But the sort of we want to acknowledge the representativeness of our group is probably not of the whole population, mostly because they are people who have heat pumps in 2024 and probably tend to be fairly far along that adoption curve. But another thing that's come up a few times is that perhaps they are unrepresentative because they are Octopus customers. So any reflections on whether Octopus's customer base are representative, and how we might kind of roll this out to consumers who are perhaps less engaged than our research cohort was.
Yeah, so the Octopus Energy now is the largest electricity supplier, and the number 1 and number 2 energy supplier. So I think the representativeness of the typical Octopus Energy customer is pretty good. It's definitely not the 20,000 customers supplier that it was at the beginning, when almost all 20,000 of those customers had proactively joined. But the HeatFlex customers are unusual, as Ollie and Danny discussed, with, as you say, early adopters of heat pumps, but also lots of them having batteries and solar and EVs. And so there is an issue of generalizing our results based on that kind of customer. Although I would point out that in some ways, those other low carbon technologies makes our results kind of conservative, because the battery and to some extent those other technologies are kind of some of the flexibility. And that's why we think we see lower impacts when we look at the whole household smart meter consumption versus just focusing on the heat pump. So I think sort of counterintuitive, as heat pumps become more widespread and we have more households where they have heat pump but maybe not battery, I think that the impact of heat pump flexibility could actually be larger and be more like those really big effects that we measured from the just heat pump consumption, rather than the still large, like it was a third reduction that Ollie showed from the smart meter, but not the more than halving that we saw from the heat pump itself. So to sort of answer the question squarely, and also kind of answer Tom's question. So Tom Lowe asked if we think that preheating with heat pumps works best when people invest in multiple low carbon technologies. I think actually maybe this is a little bit of a speculation, but maybe it's the opposite, where this is most important for customers without other low carbon technologies, especially without battery to provide flexibility, or without some type of bespoke heat storage.
Yeah, and I think it's probably depends on what your assumptions are about like what most homes will have in the future. We're obviously coming from a place as Nesta where it is essential to replace gas boilers with another technology, and we assume that heat pumps are the best option, will be present in many homes. It's going to be really good and helpful to have battery and solar PV, but in terms of like getting emissions out of homes, they're not essential. So most homes are going to have these things, and if most homes are also able to flex with them, that's going to be really helpful for the system. But we'll come back to that when we I'll come back to that later in the discussion. I wanted to bring Sarah in now. So interested in, obviously, Smart Energy GB has been promoting smart meters, which were an essential part of our trial to sort of see what was actually going on in the home. So I'm interested in any reflections you have on what we found and how it links to your current work to sort of start promoting flexibility and smart meters' role in flexibility to the general public. Any thoughts on how it links to your work?
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. And thank you ever so much for this report as well. Obviously, it's a really useful piece of research in the growing jigsaw puzzle of the electrification of our homes and ultimately making our homes net zero. I think, we ourselves worked with Cornwall Insights last year to model what the benefits are to consumers, recognizing what the national benefits are, and trying to model, look, in 2030, 2040, 2045, if you take snapshots, what could the financial benefits be, but also what might be the benefits in terms of your local infrastructure. So, Cornwall Insights, for example, said, look, if a high volume of people used flexibility in 2030, we're using FES scenarios and within what is therefore reasonable, you could potentially reduce peak to such an extent that you wouldn't need to build 4 new gas power stations, for example. So there are some huge infrastructure benefits to consumers as well, and it's important to see it through that lens. One of the questions you were talking about there was this bit about how do you scale up flexibility beyond the early adopters and those who are sort of more engaged in this stuff. And it is really important to talk about what consumer engagement looks like and what it actually does. So we know from the smart meter rollout, for example, that over 50% of smart meter installations happening in GB are a direct result of our activities, be that through our marketing, through our communications. Some of you may have seen some of our Einstein adverts, but there's an awful lot of other stuff that goes on behind the scenes that you might not have seen because you're not being targeted by it, because a lot of our work is extremely targeted to be cost effective. And what we know is that, that element of consumer engagement is not just about raising awareness in the early stages and then getting them to the level of understanding, but actually you then get into a world of persuasion, if you like, and that's a very different job, and particularly when you're talking about persuasion for every consumer or a large majority of citizens in the UK and not just the early adopters that you were talking about. So we wanted to get under the skin of this bit about flexibility, and so we're working with the Behavioural Insights team at the moment on a report and some research that starts to look at, for those who aren't necessarily involved in flexibility right now, what might persuade them in the future. Lots of really interesting findings. Obviously, it's not yet published, so I can't let you into all of those. But some of the sort of the early snippets in sort of the data and the interviews that have been going on show that consumers need a reasonable understanding of demand flexibility to feel comfortable to participate, but that is currently lacking. Although smart meter owners have a much better understanding of it than those who aren't. Their understanding of the benefits are really low. They have lots of myths in their minds about what flexibility does and doesn't do and what it might mean for them. And actually one of the really interesting points, and I know it was sort of a point of conversation we had earlier, was this bit about how comfortable are people with the concept of automation. And actually one of the tidbits that's starting to come out of the research seems to show that heat pump owners and EV owners are actually quite uneasy or are showing an uneasiness around automation. But these are all things that are not insurmountable, but they are things that consumer engagement can help with to make sure you are talking about the facts, putting out the positive case studies to counteract any negative case studies. We've already heard about surge pricing, whatever that might mean in the energy world by those who use that terminology. There is much more that can be done in that space. Some of you may have seen some of our early Marcoms. We've got one live in the market at the moment. It's only been out since September, that looks at flexibility through the lens of persuasion to get smart meters. So Angela Rippon doing some splits, using energy flexibly, the benefits of being flexible. But we're doing that as a way to, in order to get this benefit over here, that might be from your energy supplier and DFS stuff through the winter, etc. You need a smart meter to get it and therefore get a smart meter. But going forward, I think there probably is a policy question about, is there need to do more and longer term policy, public engagement around flexibility in order to hit the 2030 goals. And NESO's report last week, I think, was just so clear about why, the flexibility is so beneficial for all of us. If we can, the more people can do it, the more beneficial it is. So there's a lot in there. And I think, my sort of parting words would be the thing about consumer engagement, and I come at this from having been in the policy world, sort of energy suppliers and others, and working within SCGB. The thing that I'm struck by is that good consumer engagement is not a one and done. consumers need to, there has to be the sort of the constant rolling momentum around something in order to drive all consumers towards that action. It's not something that can be, you put that out there for a year and then it's done, and it has to be that ongoing piece of engagement. So there's lots, I think, in there. There's lots to be done, but this is a really important part of the jigsaw puzzle to show that the experience for consumers can be positive, and now that is part of the evidence base that it can then go towards persuading more to do it.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the point you kind of made about the underlying understanding of Flex and kind of why we need it, and how smart meter users perhaps understand that better. Nesta has done another much smaller scale piece of work, interviewing utilita customers who were all smart prepayment customers participating in a manual turn down service last winter around the demand flexibility service from National Grid. And in terms of broadly what we found is like a really interesting range of non-financial motivations. Like people just saw it as an opportunity to better understand what was going on in their home. Some people saw it as an opportunity to like switch off and not use energy and not like look at a screen for a few hours, to educate their children. The amount of money they were kind of successfully achieving from participating was never more than a couple of pounds really for the whole winter period. But a lot of the sort of mild objections to that service were kind of around like when the time that the events were happening. It's like, I was happy to do it, but it was a shame that it was kind of in the evening when I want to use energy the most, which obviously like most people on the call will understand why that's a problem. So just wondered if you have any kind of brief reflections on like what we need to say to people who are less able to sort of wield huge amounts of Flex now, to make sure that we're laying the groundwork for them getting engaged later.
Sure. I think, and one of the things that's really interesting in what you're talking about there is, of course, people are we're not a homogenous group. We don't all act in the same way, and your energy use is quite personal, or our family situations, our household situations are all vastly different. And one of the things we've learned through the smart meter rollout is we talk about the two different benefits messages. So we talk about the me and the we, the personal and the national. And for different people at different times, influenced such as, for example, by the external context, different messages will resonate differently. So, for example, as we're going through the energy crisis, for obvious reasons, the me benefits resonate more. But actually, when we were first coming out of COVID, the we benefits were actually quite powerful. And we know that from our experience, the two together work best in combination, leading with a me and a we. But you have to be able to understand how different segments of the population are going to respond to different messages at different time. And that's why when you do consumer engagement campaigns, the complexity of being able to understand and constantly track where different consumers are, particularly as you talk about the adoption curve, but then the usage curve, understanding that, tailoring that, segmenting that is a huge job, and it needs to be done well in order to be able to get the outcomes that you want to get to. So the answer is there's lots of things that need to happen in order to do that, and a sophisticated campaign can do that. It's not a silver bullet. Lots of other things would need to happen as well, I'm sure, in terms of policy, cost benefit, all of that sort of stuff.
Thanks, Sarah. So speaking of other things that need to happen, that's a nice segue into Marzia and Ofgem's role. I mean, I'm actually going to just bring in directly one of the questions that's been asked in the chat, which sort of covers something we were planning to talk about anyway. So Tom Lowe has asked, he's actually said it's a question for Andrew, so perhaps Andrew could come in at the end, but Marzia, to you first. How can Ofgem and government increase the use of flexibility from heat pumps, heat batteries and heat networks? What is Ofgem's role in that really?
So Ofgem's role overall on flexibility, first of all, I should say, Sarah, I loved the Einstein commercials. I hope that there's more of them. I think that there is a lack of understanding, and there has to be some sort of national campaign. So I hope that you guys also do some commercials on what flexibility is and isn't. We rely on Octopus to do a lot of this. We hope that somehow you guys get involved and explain this, because it's really, really important for our customers to understand as they bring on smart devices. So to your question, Andy, what Ofgem does, Ofgem's role overall on in getting us to CP 2030 and getting us to 2050 net zero is to look at the rule book, to say, is the rule book fit for purpose? If it's not fit for purpose, how do we make it fit for purpose? And how do we make it a bit less complicated, because we keep on adding layers and layers? How does that fit the customer journey? So that's our overall role, is to look at the system barriers and try to systematically undo those, but at the same time, understand the trade-offs. For instance, if we bring on local energy is great, but what are we doing to the supplier market if we do this? If we bring on loads and loads of consumer flex, will the system be able to take all of this load? Is the system digitized enough to take this load? So those are the things that we're working on to make sure that first, we enable the system to be a bit more digital, to be a lot more digital, so that transparency can happen, the new interactions can happen, new propositions can happen. That's one. We're trying to look at a lot of the rules right now on the market arrangements, because if you go into the ancillary services for NISO market, they have one set of arrangements. You go into the wholesale market, there's another set of arrangements. You go into the DSO markets, there's another set of arrangements. So if I can count it, there's about 25 different markets out there with 25 different arrangements. How does that work? So the Ofgem's role is now to bring in Alexon, to say, Alexon, you work with these people and you align the market arrangements to make sure that if a flex load can enter a DSO market, it should also be able to enter the BSC market. Those are the types of work streams that are active today at Ofgem. And the goal is to try to remove any sort of barriers, but with the understanding of making sure that we don't break the whole system while bringing on consumer flex forward.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thanks, Marzia. And I'm going to open up. I'll ask this question to you first, because I know it's something you have views on, and I'll see if Sarah or Andrew want to come in on it. Katie Treadwell has asked, what do you think is the importance of automation versus manual control, and for vulnerable people who are less likely to be comfortable with it but may benefit if digitally disengaged? I mean, I'll offer a quick thought on this myself first. Is when we were doing the pilot phase of HeatFlex last year, the previous winter, not the one just gone, we kind of participated in like an event on other people who were researching similar topics, and there was a very, very strong consensus in that group that automation was absolutely going to be important. And I would say, to Marzia's point, it's one of the reasons it's important is it acts as a front end for all of those potential different kind of value streams that domestic flexibility could be participating in. So to turn it into a question for you, Marzia, I know you agree, but I'll allow you to say yourself that you agree that it's important. But are there consumer protection issues that you particularly have in mind as the regulator as flexibility products come on stream?
So first, I think in the prop and leading to this call, when we talked about this, I had said that we have to automate the living something of the system. We have to automate the heck out of the system. We need to make sure that the customer journey is so simple that the customer has no idea that their heat pump is being controlled, because exactly what the results showed. The customers had participated in this. They had no idea that their heat pumps were being massaged, and that's what we need. We need that level of automation for this to work, and not just automation at the customer level. We need to also automate the system. We need the stakeholders to be able to see data easily, have access to that data. We need to make sure that whatever data that we use, that we all use the same standards. So when I'm, for instance, as simply put, if I PDF something versus, just giving a Word document, what is appropriate? What is the standard for the system? So we need as much automation as possible. As far as customer protection is concerned, it has to be proportionate. I mean, we talk about, well, what about the vulnerable customers? If we're going to automate the system right now, you think a lot of people have moved towards automation. A lot of people have iPhones. Vulnerable customers have iPhones. Non-vulnerable customers have iPhones. Now let's step back. Let's step forward to 15 years from now. 15 years from now, you would think that almost everybody should have a level of automation. Those vulnerable customers, the poor customers, the rich customers, the middle-sized customers, they should all have an understanding of automation, because that's where society is going. We don't have to sit there and educate them on automation. They're using it in their personal lives. Vulnerable customers are using it. So I don't want to somehow classify vulnerable customers as those who will never be automated. That's not right for them. That's creating some sort of a glass ceiling for them. They are going to be automated. We just need to just give this some time, and we need to build the system for it to be future-proof. Not a system. We don't need to build a system and pretend that we're from the early 2000s. We need to build a system fit for purpose for 2050, and think of the people in 2050 as well, and not think of the people in 2000.
Andy, I'm happy to come in here as well. I mean, yeah, I completely agree with you.
I was just going to, sorry, sort of to tee you up as well. Rob Hisakan, I hope you've said your name there right, Rob, was asking whether you could elaborate, Sarah, a little on what you're saying around the reticence around automation. Yeah. But please do come in.
Yeah, absolutely. So absolutely, Marzia, I agree. Automation is clearly so important, because, you know, if the more hassle things are, the bigger the barrier and the less likely people are going to want to do it. And we know that from all the sort of the data that we've done in this space. So automation is really important. A couple of things in there, though, I think we need to think about. One is probably the run up to 2030, and then afterwards, you know, bearing in mind that 2030 is not that long away. We probably are going to be asking people to do, or at least some sections of society to be doing flexibility in a way that's probably not as automated as it will end up doing in order to get to the 2030 goals. And I think there is a question there about who and how. Is it a few people doing a lot of EV, or is it a lot of people doing a little bit? You know, there's lots of questions in there about, you know, sort of what that needs to look like, and you know, pre-2030 and probably after that. And then the other thing to think about, and again, it comes back to consumer engagement, is this bit about motivation. Completely agree with you, Marcia. Vulnerable customers, of course, as all customers, want to have the iPhones, etc. But there's a really big consumer desire for that, because you're getting a huge payback. You want an iPhone for all the reasons that you want a smartphone. We have to be honest with ourselves, even as energy geeks. Flexibility is probably not as compelling for them as getting an iPhone. And so there is going to be need to make sure that the products are more compelling, the benefits are more compelling, but also to do that consumer engagement to bridge that gap, right? So to make sure that you are inspiring through that gap before those products get to that stage.
What I was saying, Sarah, is not that I think I totally agree with you that an iPhone is a toy, so we're all gonna want to learn about it. Yeah. But the beauty of an iPhone or a Samsung phone is that everybody has it. So now they have a level of automation. We should not in any way have a customer journey in energy where the customer has to do anything.
Yeah.
If that's where we are, we have failed this automation point. We have to get to a point where the customer says, yes, I agree to be a Flex customer because I have these devices. Other than that, the customer shouldn't have to do anything else. And even an inch more is a failure on our part.
And that's the dream, right? That's what we want to get to. And I think, you know, post 2030, that feels like it is where we're going to get to. On this bit about the reticence, because of the way that this piece of research is, I haven't got lots of details on what sits under it. I think the number in the top of my head is something like only 6% said that they were completely happy to go into the world of automation. And I suspect that some of that is just that it is so new, and understanding what automation really means. And that's why this research, again, coming back to why we're here today, is so important, because things like this can start filling in the gaps that says, actually, there is lots of evidence to show that you won't notice a difference to your thermal comfort. It won't do this, it won't do that. But there is a role to make sure that there is the awareness, the comfort, the trust to be able to say yes, to then get to the automation stage. And that's probably not a small role. You know, even through the smart meter rollout, we've seen that there are these myths out there about my energy company spying on me because I've got a smart meter, and it's hard to overcome those, and we work really hard to overcome those myths. And it's important, therefore, that we head off some of those early on, make sure that we're getting evidence such as this together to demonstrate what those benefits look like, and make sure we're telling the positive story.
Thanks, Sarah. Agree. Like trust is a theme that comes up so often in these events. We've spoken about this a few times now. So we're coming towards the end. We may overshoot by a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to give Andrew one more chance to come in. You were asked earlier whether you had a view on what Ofgem or the government needs to do to increase flexibility. So whether you have any thoughts on that or any other reflections on the kind of automation, and then we'll probably start wrapping up.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing I'll say just to give context, it's been in some of the comments in different ways, but recently the government has published a target that for 2030 decarbonization, that flexibility via automation has to be a central part of the government strategy. It's as Marzia was saying, it's critical. It's not just a nice to have. It's a critical enabler. In terms of what the government can do, I think some of the points raised have been great, so I don't want to repeat them. I think the half-hourly settlement, market-wide half-hourly settlement, is an underrated, important policy change because it gives stronger incentive to retailers to help bring customers along this journey. So I'm actually very, very interested in seeing what the behavior change on the retailer side is from market-wide half-hourly settlement.
Yeah, me too. Well, thanks everyone. I feel like as ever we probably could have gone on quite a bit longer with both rounds of questions. Again, we'll try and pick up some of the ones that we haven't been able to get to from attendees when we would do the mail out at the end. But thank you to all three of you, to Andrew, Sarah, and Marzia for joining us today on the panel. I would also like to, before I wrap up completely, just give a bit of a shout out to some of the other people who've worked on the HeatFlex project, in particular, Max Woolard, Louise Bernard, Maria Jacob, and Andy Marsden from Nesta and CNZ, as well as lots of people who've helped us, including Phil Steele and all the R&D team at Octopus Energy, Sean Bailey and the team in Octopus Energy Services, and some other colleagues who've contributed, such as Camille Stengel, Fede Andreas, Dan Lewis, Jess Colleen, Izzy Woolgar, Andy Hackett, Katie King, Madeline Gabriel, and Lucy Yu, who've all helped with the project. And of course, the biggest thanks of all should go to the people who participated in the trial, who volunteered to join in the first place, trusted us to take control of their heating systems in the depth of British winter, and engaged so consistently throughout the project. In many cases, went kind of above and beyond, sharing loads of insights, data they were collecting themselves, and insights of their own. So particular thanks to them for participating. So that's it. Hope that's been enjoyable for you all. You can download the HeatFlex report from the Nesta website or the Centre for Net Zero website. It's not a competition to see who gets more downloads, but we'll see how that goes. And thanks very much, and I'll see you at the next Nesta event.
Thanks all.